Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another session of our not-for-profit speaker series. I am Matthew Saha. I'm an audit partner with Cherry Bekaert, and I lead our not-for-profit industry practice for the firm. For those of you who have joined one of our first two sessions, we welcome you back. And for those who may be new or have just found the not-for-profit speaker series, we welcome you to this session, which is sure to be a good one. So thank you for joining us. I wanted to go through some quick housekeeping items before we get into introducing our speaker for today. So just as a reminder on how this all works, to get your CPE credit, you have to answer at least 3 polling questions throughout this 50-minute presentation. There will be 4 polling questions available, so you can miss one on a quick break, but make sure that you hit at least 3 of those polling questions if you want your CPE certificate. Those are going to be sent out to you within 10 days of the completion of this webinar. So you should look out for that. If you, for some reason, do not see it in your inbox within 10 days, please reach out to cbhlearning@cbh.com, and we'll make sure that we can get that to you. A recorded version of this webinar will be available at about 1 week. It takes us to get those out and posted to our website. So those will be on our not-for-profit speaker landing page as well. So look for those. If you want to revisit any of the content or the slides or get back to contact information for our speaker, you can go to that recorded version. And then if you have any questions during the presentation, we do ask that you use the Q&A window within Zoom. So you can ask questions there. We will try to answer those live to the best extent that we can. And if we have, for some reason, cannot get to a question or it's a more complex answer, we will reach out to you individually and make sure we can set up a time to get that question answered. And finally, just as a reminder, there's a short survey that will go out at the conclusion of the webinar that will pop out. Please do take 5 minutes to just fill out that short survey for us at the conclusion of the webinar. We do appreciate your feedback, and we use that in designing our future sessions. So thanks again. And why don't I go in and introduce today's speaker. So we're really happy to have Becky Droz with us. Becky is an HR advisor and compensation advisor with Catapult. Many of you probably know Catapult, who serves over 2,300 member organizations across the Carolinas and beyond, doing all sorts of guidance to help employers navigate the challenging HR issues that we run into each and every day. So Becky is primarily responsible for advising companies in the areas of compensation and benchmark data and tailoring compensation to make sure they're meeting the needs of the organization. She's got a master's in business administration from Marymount University. She got her bachelor's at the University of Illinois. She's a certified compensation professional and a senior professional in human resources as well. And obviously a subject matter expert in this area of legislative updates that are impacting employers. So I thank you, Becky, for joining us today, and I will hand it over to you for our session. Thank you so much.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to be here chatting with you today, talking about what's going on in the legislative world of human resources. Fortunately, there hasn't been too much, but we do have a couple of things that we do want to keep our eye on. So we're going to go ahead and dive into this content. I do welcome questions. So as Matt said, please feel free to use that question box. I'm happy to answer questions as we go. So throw them in there if something comes up. All right, so I have a little, it's almost like a pop quiz, and obviously you don't have to answer this out loud, but I have a question for you. I can hire or fire whoever I want to. I'm allowed to do that because that's what right to work means. Now, I know you can't talk back and speak with me, but this is a phrase that I hear all the time. As an employer, I can do whatever I want to. That's right to work. If I want to fire you, I can fire you. If I want to give you a raise, a demotion, I can do whatever I want to. Well, there's a huge problem with this statement, and that's around right to work. So right to work laws actually have absolutely nothing to do with hiring and firing whoever you want to. Right to work laws are specifically related to unions. So you may have heard of right to work states. What that really means is that if there is a union present in a facility, an individual has the option to join or not join the union. So in right to work states, if you have a union present and you have a collective bargaining agreement, the employees who come in, they're still represented by that union. That union policy, all those guidelines, grievances, that whole process is still going to stand. However, employees in right to work states have the option to actually join and pay dues. So they have the option to say, I don't want to join this union and I don't want to pay the union dues. That's what right to work means. The employment at will doctrine, that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about we can take employment actions as we see fit. Now, even with at will employment, there are some things that we want to be cognizant of, and that's related to some additional protections that we have under the law. Really, what we might say under the employment at will doctrine is I can hire and fire whoever I want to as long as it's not discriminatory. So whenever we think about those rules, people say, it's my business, I can do what I want to. But the fact is, we have to make sure that we are being cautious of all of those other laws. So we have things like Title VII that's guided by the EEOC or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So that's the things like race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, pregnancy, the list goes on, disability, genetic information. So we have all of those different protected groups. So even when we think about that employment at will doctrine, we need to be thinking about those protected classes and make sure that we're not doing something discriminatory, even unintentionally. So those words get used incorrectly all the time, but now you are experts and you know the difference between right to work and employment at will. Now I'm going to interject something here that's not actually in the slide since I did already mention the EEOC or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So breaking news as of yesterday, the EEOC released a new poster. So for many years, employers have had a posting requirement for the EEO is the law poster. It's a white poster with big blue letters that says EEO is the law. That poster has been replaced with a poster that they're calling Know Your Rights. So for those of you that have any responsibility in your organizations thinking about things like postings, that's one where you're going to want to go out, check out the EEOC and make sure that you're downloading and printing that new poster. You don't have to buy one, you can get it for free, you can print it in-house, no problem with doing that, but something that you definitely want to be aware of is that new posting requirement. Again, breaking news, the EEOC just released that yesterday, so not even in your slides. All right, we do have our first poll question here. And so this one, switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about different types of workers that we might have in an organization. So what I would like to know is what type of workers your organization utilizes. Do you have employees, so direct employees, W-2, getting that tax form every year, collecting taxes? Do you have temporary workers who come through an agency? Maybe you work with a staffing organization that provides workers. You call them up and say, hey, I need 10 people. They send somebody over. Do you have independent contractors, people who are not on your payroll? Or do you even know what kind of workers do you have in place? There are a lot of different ways that organizations can bring workers in these days, looking at employees, temporary workers, contractors. And so there are a couple different things that we're going to talk about in the context of these different types of workers, but that's why I'm kind of curious is who do you even have out there? I'll be curious to see. I'm also curious if you even know. One of the things that employers sometimes do is they say, well, we don't want people to know who's an employee or who's coming in through an agency. We want everybody to be treated the same and look the same. And there's actually some issues with that because they're not all the same. And we're going to talk about those differences in just a minute. But let's take a look and see, what do we have? All right, so 98% of our organizations participating do have employees, so direct hire employees. 39% of you are working with temporary workers coming through agencies. 67% of you have independent contractors, and a couple of you don't know, and that's okay too. All right, so why does all of this even matter? The reason that this matters is because when we think about these different types of workers, we need to think about if they are on your payroll or not. That's not necessarily the issue. The issue is how they are actually classified. So here's where this comes into play. So the first one, easy, employees. You know who they are, they work directly for you, payrolls coming through your organization or through a vendor that you use to conduct payroll, you're withholding all of those taxes. You are paying unemployment tax. You are providing workers' comp coverage. You are doing all those protections and all those requirements for actual employees. The issue is sometimes where we get with those temporary workers where they're coming through an agency. So somebody else technically employs them, but they're getting direction from your company. Now, some organizations say, hey, if they're temp workers, I don't really care. I'm not worried about them. I don't care about discrimination laws. I don't care about their payroll. I don't care about equal pay. I don't care about any of that. But the fact is that even if you have a temporary worker that's coming through another agency, you do have to care because you have some liability as a joint employer. If you have workers who are getting direction from your leaders, from your managers, they're telling them what to do, they're doing any kind of performance evaluation, they're making decisions about whether you want that temporary worker to come back and work, you do have to care. Now, you don't want to treat them exactly the same as an employee because they're not, but they are also people that you still need to think about all those laws and protections that we have, those still apply. So if you have somebody who comes to your organization and is working there through a temp agency and you're like, I don't really like them, or, they violated one rule or they rolled their eyes when I gave them instruction, just get rid of them. I don't really care. I don't want them. I just don't want them here. That could be an issue. You need to make sure that even if you're working with a temp agency and you're saying, send me people or sending people back because you don't like them, you still need to be following good practice when it comes to thinking about things like business justification. So is there a reason somebody is doing well for you? Is there a reason a temporary worker is not doing well? You can't just, be real loose about it and say, I can do whatever I want to. They're not even our employee. Can't do that. You have to be cautious about that from that joint employer standpoint. Now, the bigger issue that we run into is having people who are classified as independent contractors. And in our poll, we saw quite a few of your organizations are using independent contractors. And the issue is when they are misclassified. So why does it matter? Well, think about those taxes. The IRS wants their money. Think about unemployment. We need to make sure that we're paying the proper unemployment insurance, workers' comp. And there are some others as well, but those are typically the big ones. So how do you know if somebody is an employee versus truly an independent contractor? So there are a couple different ways to look at it, and it can get a little bit gray, but one of the things you have to ask yourself is the work that that individual is performing, how integral is that to your business operation? Are they performing a really key function of your business? Then that could be a sign that they may actually need to be classified as an employee and not an independent contractor. The other thing we might think about is the opportunity for profit or loss. I do a lot of comp work. So let's say that you wanted me to come be an employee. Perhaps I take over, I work in your compensation and benefits department. If I come and I work for you, there's not a profit or loss. I'm performing the work and collecting my paycheck. However, if I'm a contractor that you bring in because that work is not integral, you're asking me to do a special one-time project, and I have the opportunity to make a profit because I'm able to charge an appropriate fee and I'm able to cover the bills and expenses that I have, then potentially I'm an independent contractor. If I tell you, hey, I can do this job for $50 and I lose a lot of money because of it, okay, that's the opportunity for loss, that risk that I've taken on. The other thing that we can think about when we're looking at employees versus contractors is equipment and kind of the investment of the worker. Are you providing the tools and equipment for somebody to do the job? Are you providing the laptop? Are you providing the cell phone? Are you providing the email accounts? Are you providing, the CRM? All of that different context of information of equipment and tools. If you're providing that, then again, that's something where this could be an employee versus on that contractor side, a contractor is providing their own tools. They're providing their own equipment. So if you hired me for a comp study and I'm an employee, then I'm using your equipment, you're paying for my access to data, you're paying for my Excel, all that good stuff. But as a contractor, then I would be responsible for all those expenses on my own. The other thing we might think about is the ability for somebody to go and work somewhere else or to work with multiple clients. If you have something that says that that individual can only be a worker for you and they're not able to go out and take in other projects or other clients, then that potentially is somebody, again, where we need to examine that relationship. The other thing we might think about is the degree of control. How much policy or process are you enforcing on that worker? If you are dictating how the work is done, when the work is done, where the work is done, that's probably an employee. If you're saying, hey, we want a deliverable, we want a presentation and a spreadsheet, we don't care how you get there, we don't care what time of day you do it, you might have a deadline, but if that individual has the flexibility to determine how the work is done, then that might truly be a contractor. This is something that the IRS has really been going after, I'd say for probably the last few years. So having employees properly classified is really important. We don't want to be misclassifying people as independent contractors when in fact they are not. There's a lot of risk here for employers and going back the different wages and penalties. So certainly something that we don't want to run afoul of the law in this area. One of the other areas that I see issue with this from employers is they say, well, we signed an agreement. We put together an agreement that says that person's a contractor. So when we look at the IRS and we look at the Department of Labor, they're going to say, I don't care if you have a piece of paper that says, oh, they agreed to be a contractor. If it looks like an employee and it smells like an employee, it's an employee, and that's how you need to treat the worker. So a lot of risk here that a lot of organizations just say, I'm not really worried about it, but definitely something you want to be aware of. All right, we do have another poll here. So one of the things that we talk about in the context of employees is, of course, pay. I love pay, I love money. So when we think about pay, one of the things that we might think is that, hey, as long as that person is paid an annual salary, I don't have to worry about overtime. As long as I say, hey, you're making $60,000 a year, that's the end of it, that's where it stops. That's how I make a pay decision. So I'll be curious to say this one's a true or false, or again, perhaps you don't know. But when it comes to pay, I'm curious about what your thoughts are here. With this particular question, the issue is not about how somebody is paid. The issue that we really have here is around the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so when we think about the Fair Labor Standards Act, we need to be thinking about exemptions in a whole. So we need to be thinking about how do all of these different parts and pieces of an individual's job fit together, not just about how they're paid. So I'm curious to see if you all got that and see what does this tell us? Okay, so awesome. This is false, of course. So you guys got that one. Perfect. I've got a good group today. So when we're thinking about the exemptions, what we're really talking about is the difference between non-exempt and exempt. So under the Fair Labor Standards Act, all employees need to record and count all of their hours. So they need to have some way to track their time. Now, you don't have to have a fancy system. It doesn't have to be biometrics. It doesn't have to be clocking in or out at a time clock or on your computer. But technically under the law, everybody is non-exempt and everybody needs to track those hours. Individuals who work more than 40 hours in a work week are due overtime at 1.5 times the regular rate of pay. So when you define work week, it doesn't have to start on a Sunday. It doesn't have to start on a Monday. You can define when that work week starts and ends, but it's any 7 consecutive periods of 24 hours. So as long as you've got a set work week and you're capturing those hours, anything over 40 is going to be time and a half the regular rate of pay. We won't go too deep into regular rate of pay, but I will just mention that if you pay any kind of bonus or incentive pay, you need to be thinking about regular rate of pay. In some situations where you have bonuses, you may need to be calculating overtime on those as well. So something to be aware of. Now, one of the things with our non-exempts is we think about meal periods and rest periods. If you have folks who are clocking out or they're able to step away and be truly broken away from their duties, if that break or that meal period is 30 minutes or longer, then typically you can say, all right, that's going to be unpaid time. So if you say, yep, you can go, even if you require somebody to stay on site, but they're able to sit in a break room, they're still somebody who's going to be considered non-exempt. They're still somebody who then you can say, hey, we're not going to pay that period just because it is at least 30 minutes. The other thing with non-exempt employees that we need to think about is travel. There are a lot of different rules around travel when it comes to non-exempt employees. So it depends if they're overnight. Are they in their local city? How long are they gone? Does it cut across normal working hours, even if it's on a Saturday or Sunday when normally they wouldn't work? So a lot of areas with travel, and I won't go into the details here unless anybody has specific questions about travel, but when we think about non-exempt employees, definitely some things we need to be aware of from a Fair Labor Standards Act component. So with non-exempt, that's typically what we think about with our hourly people. So non-exempt, under the law, anybody can be non-exempt. And that's how I would always start. I would say this employee is non-exempt unless they meet certain requirements that allow them to be exempt from the law. So a lot of people get that mixed up, non-exempt, exempt. Typically we think of non-exempt as hourly. And again, if you're not sure, the safe side, on err on the side of caution and say start with non-exempt, and now let's see if we can make that change and classify somebody as exempt, which typically we think about as being that annual salary type of employee. So an exempt employee is paid on a salary basis. So that means that for every week there is a fixed amount of pay. Currently, the salary level is $684 a week. That translates to $35,568 annually. So an individual has to be paid at least that level, and they have to be paid on a salaried basis. So we're not calculating hours. So if somebody does meet the exemption requirements, then we don't have to track hours and we don't have to pay overtime at time and a half. But again, it's not just pay. More critical is to think about the job duties. So when we look at the FLSA, there are a variety of different exemptions that would allow an employee to be exempt from those overtime and time tracking requirements. And there are a couple common ones. So let me talk about a couple of the common ones. The first one is going to be the managerial exemption. So that one's pretty easy. We understand what managing people is. So if you have a worker, an employee who manages at least 2 or more full-time or full-time equivalents, and their primary duty is managing people, then they could be exempt, as long as then you also pay that salary basis and you pay it at least that salary level. Another common one is the administrative exemption. This is the one that is probably the most misunderstood and where employees often misclassify employees as exempt. So under the administrative exemption, you have an employee who is responsible for running the business. This is not manual work. This is not somebody in production. This is somebody who is able to act with discretion and independent judgment. So are they able to set policies? Are they able to deviate from policies? Are they able to make decisions? Are they able to bind the company in financial matters? Are they able to sign financial agreements? Are they able to resolve issues and handle customer complaints in a way that's beyond following a script? So if you have somebody who meets those requirements where they have that discretion and independent judgment, then they may meet the job duties test under that administrative exemption. Those are probably the two most common. I would say the third most common is the professional exemption, or it's sometimes called the learned exemption. This is the one where typically, if you think about a degree requirement is basically a barrier to being in that field, then you might have somebody meet that professional exemption. So typically thinking about an engineer, if you're a mechanical engineer, typically you have to have a degree in mechanical engineering. If you are teachers are different, so I can't say teachers. If you are somebody who is required to have a specific degree in that specific area in order to perform that work, that's where your professional exemption is typically going to come in. Not just any job like a teacher where you may be required to have a degree, but it has to be very specific. So that professional exemption, again, is another common one. One of the things I want to point out here as far as an update goes is to keep an eye out for a change on this salary level. So the Fair Labor Standards Act, they a few years ago changed the salary level. It used to be $455 a week, but then it went to $684 a week. And I think we're going to see a change come out next year. So that's something to keep an eye out for, especially if you do have some folks that are classified as exempt, but they're closer to that $35,600 annual figure. We want to keep an eye on those folks because that level is likely going to change. I've seen a whole slew of numbers as to what it might actually be. I don't know what it's going to be. My personal guess is it's probably going to be just a few $1,000s more than where it is. I don't think it's going to be significant, but who knows? The Department of Labor, they could surprise me and they could come up with something bigger. All right. The other thing I want to talk about when we talk about pay is the idea that you can deduct whatever you want to from an employee. This is a direct correlation to that exemption and non-exemption status. So for an employee who is non-exempt, again, thinking generally these tend to be your hourly workers, if you want to deduct from somebody's pay, you have to have an authorization signed for the exact amount prior to that deduction. So if you say, hey, you break a phone or you don't turn in a laptop, we're gonna recoup that money. For a non-exempt employee, you can do that, but you have to have it in writing for that exact amount. So one of the things I would recommend here is that if you're giving out equipment or tools that you expect to be returned or you want to deduct for that, when you give them out, at that point is when I would get the agreement that says, if I don't return this equipment in good working order, my pay will be deducted, $50, $20, whatever that amount is. They then have the option, and this would be written on your form as well, that says, hey, I can withdraw this consent to have this deduction made, but you want to make sure that you're doing that up front, not after the fact. Because if you have an issue, let's say somebody quits or somebody gets fired, and now you're trying to collect monies back, it's going to be real hard to get an authorization that says, yeah, sure, deduct pay for me. If you do make a deduction from a non-exempt employee with their authorization, you still cannot drop them below minimum wage. So they still have to be making at least $7.25 an hour. And you also cannot deduct from any overtime earnings in that period. So a couple things to look out if you are making deductions. Now, with your exempt employees, it is really hard to make a deduction from their pay. So there are minor allowances, because if you think back to that previous conversation, we said they had to be paid on a salaried basis. That means you can't be deducting hours, or excuse me, deducting wages for almost any situation. There are very few where you're actually able to do that. You're able to do it in the first and last week of work. So if you have an exempt employee that you hire, let's say your week starts on Sunday, they don't start till Wednesday, that's fine. Then you can pay them for Wednesday forward. Same thing if you have somebody who leaves, maybe their last day is a Wednesday, but your pay week goes to Friday, you don't have to pay those last 2 days that somebody didn't work. Now, if an individual says, hey, I want to take time off, it's my own personal business, it has nothing to do with work, I'm not ready, willing, and able to work, for a full day, you could dock that pay. The time that I typically see this is when you have a new employee who does meet those exemption requirements and they're new and perhaps they're not eligible for time off yet. Maybe they're not allowed to take vacation time or they don't accrue PTO, and they say, hey, I know you're hiring me, but I've already got this trip planned and I need to take these 2 days off. That's one where sometimes we see organizations make that deduction for that full day only. Now, if you have a true time off, a true bona fide PTO policy that says you have this many days, or you accrued a certain rate, and you have somebody that doesn't have that time, you can again deduct those days, but they have to be full days. So you can't do any partial time. One of the ones that gets hairy for folks is around weather. If your organization closes for a full week because of weather, then you can withhold, you don't have to pay that full week. But let's say you have employees show up Monday and Tuesday, and on Wednesday, a snowstorm blows through and you have to shut down. If that individual performed any work during that week, you still have to pay that full week. So again, very difficult to deduct from that exempt person. The last one I will call out is if somebody has FMLA or family medical leave that's approved, that's one of the few times where you can deduct from that exempt pay as well. But typically, if you have an exempt employee, you are promising free and clear that you are paying their full wages. It is very rare that you're going to be deducting from that individual's wages. I will just mention, I'm not talking about things like, payroll deduction for medical or dental benefits. That's a little bit different. Those you have an authorization from employees and you're able to make those deductions, of course. So that's not what I'm talking about here. I just want to make sure that's clear as well. All right. So the next one, I've got a little just in your mind, you can answer question. If my employee trips walking down the hall because they're wearing platform heels, then I don't have to worry about workers' comp. They shouldn't be wearing those shoes to work. So let's talk about workers' comp for a minute. This is one where it's different by state. Each state has different laws around workers' comp and how many employees you have to have before you need to have workers' comp coverage. But essentially, it is a no-fault policy. And early in my HR career, whenever we had anything around workers' comp, I was super nervous about it. And I'd be like, I don't understand what this is. I don't know what it is. It is not that complicated. It is an insurance policy. Workers' comp is basically an insurance policy that says if somebody gets hurt or somebody gets sick because of work or in the scope of their normal work, then there is coverage for any medical treatment that's needed, as well as for the lost time. That's really what workers' comp is all about. And so if somebody can't be there, so they're not making their wages, then that's the situation where your workers' comp may help cover part of that. And again, with the different states, the rules vary about when that coverage kicks in. Some of them you don't get anything for that first week. Some of them you don't get anything for the first week unless it continues for another 2 weeks. Then it's retroactive. The rules really change by state. So something to be aware of, but you want to make sure that if you need to have that coverage that you do and that you're compliant with whatever your state's industrial commission requires. Now, it's a no-fault system. So again, what that means is if somebody gets hurt or somebody gets sick in the scope of normal work, they are going to be covered with that workers' comp coverage. So in this situation where we've got somebody wearing tall shoes, it doesn't matter what shoes they're wearing. If you had a slip, trip, or a fall in your facility, workers' comp is going to cover it. Now, if you have a policy that says you need to be wearing safety shoes, I've never seen a safety shoe that came in a platform heel, but maybe there's something out there. But if you're required to have a safety shoe, maybe somebody could be written up. You could still hold somebody accountable because they failed to comply with a safety requirement on the type of shoes that they're wearing, but they're still going to have that coverage if they get hurt. Now, there is an exception to this, and that is if you have somebody who's drunk or high. So if you have somebody who knows that they are, they're intoxicated and impaired, and that is creating an issue in the way that they perform, in the way they perform, and then they get hurt or they get sick, that one you can say, all right, workers' comp is going to be denied. So again, if somebody is intoxicated and you have proof of that, then that's something where workers' comp coverage may not go into effect. The other one is if you have knowledge that somebody was willfully trying to injure themselves or really trying to do something that could potentially take their own life at work. In that situation, then workers' comp would also be denied as well. I do see a question over in the chat, so let me just pop back over and look at that since it's back on the exempt, non-exempt. So the question is that we have folks both non-exempt and exempt, we have exempt and non-exempt, with corporate credit cards. And the question is, can we ask them to sign an agreement that says the amounts charged that are not business expenses will be withheld from their pay? So yes, you can have that agreement that says, hey, you've got a business card, but when it gets down to it, if you have charges that you need to withdraw from for that non-exempt employee, then you need to make sure that you get it in writing and you need to have the exact amount, the exact day and time. Now with your exempt employees, that one might be a bigger challenge. That one, depending, the exact wording of your agreement, which I would check with an attorney if you're going to do that, you may not be able to recoup that money. You may not be able to deduct that money for your employees because then you're not offering their pay free and clear. So definitely a caution there for those exempt folks. Hopefully that answered your question. All right, and we're going to keep on rolling. All right, next question for you. What percent of US employees belong to a union? Is it 10%, 25%, or 50%? I'm going to spend quite a bit of time. I know we've kind of gone through some of these other areas fairly quickly, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about unions this morning because there's a lot of activity happening in the US right now around unions. So I want to definitely bring the union activity to your attention and just talk about some of the things that are going on there. But I'll be curious to see if you all know how many members in the US actually belong to unions. For those of you that are down in my southern states, you'll probably know that we tend to not be very unionized. When we look at data, what we see is that both Hawaii and New York tend to be the most unionized states. About 22% in those states tend to be members of unions. And South Carolina and North Carolina, those two states most often have the lowest unionization rates. Oh, I like the split here. All right, so with the question of what percent of US employees belong to unions, we have 39% said 10%, 54% of you said 25%, and 7% thought that it was around 50%. So the actual number here is 10%. So if we look at US employees in total, it is 10% that belong to unions. As I mentioned, Hawaii and New York tend to be higher, North Carolina, South Carolina lower, and those don't really change. I think, there's often a lot of questions I get around, why is that? I think part of it is just when we think about, industrial revolution and some of the manufacturing that came out of the North, that's where we tend to see a lot of unions historically. And I think it's really just kind of stayed that way. I think part of it is cultural and just based on the different regions. The other part of that is thinking about states like Hawaii and New York, where you have a greater amount of tourism and hospitality. Often when we see those jobs, those tend to be lower wage jobs. And so we'll see unionization for that reason as well. When we think about unionization, there's also more individuals in the public sector tend to be union members, so it's about 34%. And when I say public sector, what I'm thinking about there is like teachers, firefighters, police officers. If we look at private sector, it's only about 6%. So much lower rate when we look at unionization in the private sector. When we look at the data around who joins unions, typically workers ages 45 to 54 tend to have the highest rates, and the younger workers 16 to 24 tend to have the lowest rates. So that's kind of why we see, or excuse me, that's kind of who we see actually join unions. So your question here is, I don't need to worry about the National Labor Relations Act because my employees are not unionized. This is a very common misconception that a lot of employers fall into trap with. So one, it doesn't matter if you have a union or not, you need to be aware of the National Labor Relations Act because it does very much apply to all organizations. It is not just if you already have a union. The biggest piece of that is around concerted activity. So that means that your employees are allowed to talk about things like wages, hours, and working conditions if they're looking for the mutual benefit or aid to improve the quality of work life or pay for a group of employees. So basically, if it's from two people saying, hey, we want something to be better about this workplace, whether it's the environment or the pay, it could be the holiday, it could be the insurance, any of those things. That's all protected activity. So this law has been around for a long time, even though a couple of years ago we had an executive order from the president that said, hey, at least in the federal side, we can't tell employees, we can't punish them for talking about wages. Technically, that was already a law. You can't punish people for talking about wages. For many years, we had organizations that would have handbooks and say, hey, you can't talk about this, you can't disclose this. That has been forbidden since this law came out in 1935. That's concerted activity. So that's the first part of it we need to be aware of. The other thing that I really want to point out is some legislation that's going on, it's not going on, but that was proposed. So we have something that's called the PRO Act, or the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. And last year in 2021, it passed in the House. And I'm going to talk about the different parts of this legislation in a minute. So passed in the House, did not go to the Senate yet. I don't think it would pass in the Senate. I just don't think that would happen. But I think there are parts and pieces of this PRO Act that the National Labor Relations Board might choose to adopt and might take bits and pieces and start to implement and enforce those. And some of them are pretty, to me, they would be pretty disruptive to the workforce. So let's talk about what some of those are. So the first thing, if you think about the very first discussion point we had today about right to work and employment at will, if you remember, a right to work state says an employee can join or not join a union. Right now, we have 27 states that have right to work laws. And so if the PRO Act were to pass, or potentially a piece that could be picked up, is to say that states can no longer have right to work laws. And they would essentially become states where if a union exists in a facility and somebody is hired on there, or somebody is an employee there, they have to join the union and pay dues. So that would be a huge change for those 27 states. If you have a union in place and you don't have a lot of employees that actually join, they don't have the same financial resources available. And so that's something where it restricts the ability for some different actions to take place just because they don't have money to do it. So that's a huge piece of this legislation to be aware of. Again, PRO Act potentially could eliminate right to work laws, which would be a major change. Some of the other things that would happen are around the activities of forming unions. There are a lot of rules already about what you can and can't do if there is any kind of union activity. But one of the things that would happen, I know if I were in a facility where there were some talk about unionization or there were rumblings that employees were thinking about unionizing, as an employer, I would want to get people together and have a conversation about it. I would want to get together and understand what's driving that, what improvements can we make, what do we think would be good about it, what do we think would be bad about it. And under this legislation, it would ban captive audience meetings. So with this PRO Act legislation, if you have a group that says, hey, we're thinking about unionizing, no longer can the employer pull everybody into a room and say, hey, let's talk about what's going on when we hear about some of this activity to form a union. So that would be a pretty disruptive change as well. One of the other things that you would need to do is that if you have a union, the way that it works, if you have a negotiation, you have a contract, there's a process involved. Let me back up there. There's a process involved in order to form a union. And so typically what happens is you collect union cards, the individuals do, that says at least 30% of employees are interested in having a union. At that point, the National Labor Relations Board will get involved and they'll work with the employer about when and where they're going to hold an election. The employer has to post different signs about the meetings and about how an employee would vote for that union or vote against that union. And once that happens, if there is a vote, it's a simple majority that then dictates whether or not that union is going to be formed and recognized. Now, once that happens, let's say it passes, a vote passes, employees vote that we want to unionize, there's a period of time where the employer and that union have to go through a process of collective bargaining and develop that collective bargaining agreement. That can take a long time. So you could potentially have a facility where employees vote to create a union, but it takes years for them to get to an actual collective bargaining agreement that they all ratify and agree to. And so during that period, the union, they're not in power yet. They're not collecting money or dues from employees yet. And so one of the things with this law is it would eliminate part of that and say, hey, if you're not bargaining in good faith, we can enforce these contracts. So if the union is voted in, the National Labor Relations Board could say, hey, you can't spend years working through this contract. This is the contract. So it could be, difficult for the employer to have some of that ability to bargain and negotiate for what they wanted to have in that agreement. And so that's something else that could certainly have a huge impact. One of the other things that could happen here is that if your organization uses email to send out communications to employees, which many do, you would have to allow the use of that company email for sending out information about the union as well. So if there's union activity, meetings, things like that, basically solicitation for the union, you would have to allow your corporate email to be used for that as well. So definitely some things to be aware of here. And the reason I really want to spend the time here talking about this is because there has been a big increase in the amount of union activity that we've seen. Typically, there are about 1,200 petitions filed a year, petitions filed with the National Labor Relations Board around union organizing activity. So what we've seen is that in the first 6 months of 2022, that the number of petitions filed with the National Labor Relations Board has gone up 57% since the same time last year. So there's been a 57% increase in the amount of petitions filed with the National Labor Relations Board. That's pretty big. And if you have a facility where you have interest and you have at least 30%, they have interest, the National Labor Relations Board comes in and they actually do have a vote, it's typically successful about 70% of the time. So if you have employees who have an interest, it gets to that point of actually having a vote, 70% of the time, that is going to come to fruition and you're going to have that union there. So definitely some things to be aware of there. One of the things I also want to mention here is just the rules around unions. Typically there's an acronym called TIPS that talks about the things that employers can't do. Personally, I kind of like spit because I can remember that better than I can remember TIPS. But with that union activity, as an employer, you want to make sure that you're never making any kind of threats, that you're not interrogating employees about any type of union activity, that you're not making any promises, and that you're not spying on employees. So I mentioned that TIPS or SPIT acronym just because as we see that huge uptick with that 57% increase in activity, something to be aware of so that you don't run afoul and end up with an unfair labor charge where you don't want to have it. I'm just checking. I don't see any questions. I'm going to keep rolling. Again, certainly feel free to throw out questions on anything that we've gone through. All right, let's go ahead and go to my next slide. All right. I'm so glad that whiny employee quit. I don't have any risks since they decided to leave before I fired them. So this is definitely an issue, but it's another pitfall that I see employers run into where they think, hey, if I have an employee and I'm glad that they're gone, I think about regrettable and unregrettable turnover. I have some of those folks that I'm like, oh, thank goodness they just quit. There can still be some risk there on the employer side. So one of the things that we need to be thinking about is when we have these terminations or we have this kind of, turnover, is it for cause? Is it something where it's involuntary and the employer is making the decision? Or is it voluntary and it's really the employee's decision? We want to make sure that we're capturing proper information so that we know in case there's something else that happens. Because from a risk standpoint, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, we need to think about any kind of pending action that's going on. Has that individual filed any kind of complaint? Is there any potential that there's a perception of retaliation? Is there any potential issue? Have they filed a lawsuit or do they have a charge with the EEOC? Whether it's voluntary or involuntary, we want to pause. We want to ask ourselves, do we have protected class involved? Do we have any risk there? Could somebody go to the EEOC? Do we have any releases that we need to get before somebody leaves? Perhaps it's a reminder of proprietary information. Perhaps if you are sending, a person out, or maybe you have a layoff, you want to make sure that you're not doing anything that could be perceived as discriminatory, even if, the intent is not there. If in the data it looks like it, then there's going to be an issue. So we want to make sure that we are looking at all of these things before we make these types of decisions. One of the other things that I want to mention, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, is the critical piece of documentation. In the world of human resources, I always say, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. So we need to make sure that no matter what the issue is, when we have a separation, that we have captured why. If it was for cause, especially, we want to make sure that we have a sufficient, document, a history that says, why was this person terminated? We want to make sure that we're able to say, this is a business reason. This is why this person was terminated. This was their action or behavior, and this is the consequence, versus, we just decided that we didn't like people over 40 today, so we decided to fire them. That's what we don't want to have happen. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about any risk involved. I do see a question that just popped up that was about what percent of employees are unionized. 10%. 10% is the amount of employees in the US that are unionized. All right, I'm going to pause there. Any questions about the separation piece? I do see a question that just came in. A forced resignation, is that voluntary? So that is a great question. So if you have something where the option is, we're going to let you quit or you're going to be fired, you're making that decision. I would document what you're doing. And I would say, if it's something where that person's going to be terminated, I would still want to have a record of why you were going to do that. And then I would document, why did you allow them to quit instead of be terminated? I would want to make sure that I was honest in all of my record keeping. And then if it came to unemployment, or if it came to a charge of discrimination, that you could very much say, because of these actions, they were going to be terminated, but they then chose to resign instead. Some organizations do that because they want to allow someone to save face. It makes it easier. They can go out and say, hey, I chose to leave this position. And if there's something that's not so egregious, that's probably okay. But if an employee has done something that's really egregious and you're going to allow them to quit instead of be fired, I would want to pause and push back on that. If they got into a physical altercation or they were stealing, I would want to make sure that you've got that properly captured. And I wouldn't want to just say, oh, well, that person just quit, don't know why. Because then you have some risk there. If you're honest and you're doing things with good intent, the information is truthful, then as an employer, you have some protections there. So it's kind of a gray area when you want to allow somebody to do that. Certainly companies do it, but I would just be very cautious about going that path. All right, so our next poll question is switching gears a little bit, and this is about the Form I-9. So your poll question is, where are completed Form I-9 sent? Do they get sent to US Customs and Immigration? Do they get sent to the Department of Labor? Does the organization keep them internally? Or the answer might be, I have no idea. Now, I will say that this Form I-9 that I'm asking the question about is the one piece of documentation that if you have even one employee, you have to fill out a Form I-9. So other laws have different thresholds of when they apply. I mentioned earlier, Title VII and protected classes, typically those apply to 15 or more employers. Age discrimination doesn't kick in until 20 employers. So different rules for different laws when it comes to employee headcount. But this I-9, if you have even one employee, you are required to fill out this Form I-9. So I'll be curious to see if you know what happens with that form. All right, perfect time. Let's see, what do we have here? All right, awesome job. You all got this one as well. So with that Form I-9, the organization does keep them. They don't get filed anywhere, so they stay on site at the employer, and there are actually specific retention rules around how long you have to keep them. And with that form, what it does is essentially it verifies that an individual is who they say they are. So there's an identity component, and then it also verifies an individual's right to work. So there are two parts to that form that are getting that identity and their authorization to work in the US. And so with that form, the employee fills out a piece, and then the employer fills out a piece of the information to verify that. Again, you keep that internally, but if you were to have an audit, the Department of Labor, Customs and Immigration, you would want to make sure that you have those forms and that you have them properly completed for every worker that you have. Now, some states also have an additional requirement, or if you're federal contractors, you have additional requirements to use something called E-Verify. So the E-Verify system, essentially what it does is it takes the information that you've captured on that Form I-9 and it compares it to information from Social Security Administration and Department of Homeland Security. So it's a second step to verify that information. And at face value, that's easy enough. The part where employers get into trouble is when they have something that's a tentative non-confirmation. So if you have information and it doesn't match, you've entered that, sometimes what will happen is you get this notice that says, hey, something is off here, something doesn't add up, and the employee needs to go and handle that. Some employers say, oh my gosh, if we got this tentative non-confirmation, we need to get them out, let's fire them, let's send them out of here. That's what you don't want to do. What you want to do is follow the information exactly as the E-Verify system tells you. It will give you the letters to give to the employee. It will give you the letter to put in their file. You want to make sure that when that tentative non-confirmation happens, that worker has the ability to go and follow the timeline so that they can resolve that issue. Sometimes there truly are just issues, things that haven't been updated. Perhaps something was keyed in wrong. You want to make sure that you give that worker an opportunity to get that corrected. And you don't want to just say, oh my gosh, you're fired, get out of here. That's where you can get into trouble. One of the things that I want to mention here around I-9s is that a new I-9 will likely be coming out soon. They revised it a few years ago. To me, it got more complicated. I used to love when it was just a one-pager, but that was so much easier. Now it's 2 pages plus a list of approved identification, and there's also a 70-page guide to fill out this form. So I am really curious what this new form is going to look like, but I do anticipate that we're going to have a new Form I-9 coming out pretty soon. And that is part of the requirement. If you were to have an audit, you would want to make sure that based on the date of the hire, that you are using the form that is in place at the time. So something we definitely want to keep an eye out for from another form standpoint. All right. I want to check and make sure that we have any questions, any information. We are just getting right to the end here, and I want to make sure that if there's something we talked about, I know I'm a fast talker. If there's anything that we didn't hit that you want to hit on, anything else in the HR space, please throw it out there. Let me know. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions come in, but I was told that this group likes jokes, so I'm going to throw one out there. So how do you mend a broken pumpkin?
I might have told this one last time.
Oh, it's a pumpkin patch.
Pumpkin patch. That's
All
right.
right, if you told that one, I have to give you one more. So
Okay,
why did the scarecrow win a medal? She was outstanding in her field.
I think I told that one too last time, Becky, but those are both good ones.
All right, then I'm just going to stop there.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Becky. Really appreciate your time and your expertise. And please feel free to reach out to Becky should you have any follow-up or want to engage with her expertise in your organization. So we appreciate it. And thank you again for all those who have joined this session, and be on the lookout for upcoming sessions as well. We've got at least a few more here before the end of the calendar year. So as always, make sure to sign up for those at our website, cbh.com. So thank you, and bye-bye.